أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm continuing my short series on events that led to the abolition of the Khilafah. Individual effort really by me to try and illustrate some of the factors that led to it so that we can learn and that can inform our understanding of the historical events, the geopolitics of today even, and some of the challenges that will be faced in future. Today's discussion is about some of the internal factors and internal schisms within the Uthmani Khilafah, which links to some of the points we've talked about before in terms of the evolution of ideas, particularly nationalism and secularism. So I'm going to we've talked about the events of the 3rd of March, the importance of the demise of the Khilafah, the impact in the Muslim world. We've talked about some of those political ideas. Today is going to be internal factors and schisms, and then in future presentations, we're going to talk about external factors. So when we talk about the internal factors that were causing divisions, remember my presentations here are an overview of things. They're not to go into details, but I think if I can help to give some kind of overview, then I think more of you can go off and research these things yourself, inshallah. In 1853 to 1856 was the Crimea War, a war between the Uthmani Khilafah, the Ottoman Khilafah, Britain and Russia. In that war, Britain and the Ottomans were allies, and it actually was one of the first occasions when the Ottomans lost a war and lost major territory to the Russians. This had a huge impact internally, but also in terms of the shock within the Ottoman Khilafah, but also externally how it was perceived. And in the Treaty of Paris that came some years after that, where there were supposed to be provisions that protected the Ottomans, those provisions were serially broken by other states and more territory was lost. And that was added to by separatist movements in the Balkans, Serbia, in particular in Eastern Europe, areas like Bulgaria and Hungary and these parts of Eastern Europe, which were once part of the Ottoman Khilafah. And later in World War I, we saw the rise of Arab revolts. Eventually, you saw loss of huge territories and whole provinces and a general falling behind in the Ottoman Khilafah because in comparison, the material progress in Europe in the previous decades had been very great. Due to the Industrial Revolution. So materially, technologically, for the first time in its history, the Khilafah was actually seen to be technologically behind and materially behind. Catching up with that and the loss of territories put the state into huge debt owed to foreign powers. And all of this, by the middle and end of the 19th century, led to this impression of a sick man. It was known as the sick man of Europe, which in turn fueled internal schisms and political intrigues. Now, some of this led to calls for reform. And one of the reasons there were calls for reforms were if you're in debt to other countries around the world, if you're allying from a position of weakness for the first time ever, other countries are going to call the shots as to what conditions they're going to have to ally with you. One of the encouragements and conditions that was put were for the Ottomans to reform their systems, to be more in line with other countries. And we've seen this in recent years, even with the way, for example, the European Union engaged with Turkey, wanting it to align Turkish laws, policies, and values with the European ones. And they were always putting this up as a pretext to block membership of the European Union. So there were phases in the Turkish administrations where they were trying to reform, to align themselves, westernize even more. Well, this was not actually very new with the Ottomans, because what you saw was a period of reform known as the Tanzimat, which went on between about 1838 and 1876. And this was actually brought about after a treaty with Britain, a treaty known as the Treaty of Balta Liman in 1838. And in that treaty, it actually was to give Britain more favorable trading status, so that tariffs were not put on goods which were being traded with Britain. Again, negotiating from a position of weakness rather than from a position of strength. But there were also calls to reform in line with Napoleonic Code, French law. But the key thing here, even though secular laws were being implemented, they all had to be justified with a semblance of Islamic evidence by the Sheikh al-Islam. So the Ottoman Khilafah, right till the end, there was still this necessity to try and be seen to be conforming with Islamic principles. Ultimately, we saw not just a reorganization of tariffs, we saw changes in the finance system, in the civil and criminal code, in the guilds, in education, in the Ottoman Bank, the establishment of an Ottoman bank, so the idea of a central banking like in the Western countries, and even the decriminalization of homosexuality. And you can see in historical documents how these changes were being encouraged and brought into favor by foreign governments. So this is a communique between Viscount Palmerston to Sir Strafford Canning, a diplomat in the Ottoman state, and he's talking about how it's very favorable that the Ottomans are, the Sultan has given changes in the state in terms of to the Protestants in the Ottomani Khilafah. So here you see that encouragement. It's just one thing, and over a period of time you saw these reforms happening in this way. I mean, there's a lesson here for us. A lesson is reforms and revival are two different things. Sometimes the motivation that some people tried to put through these reforms was actually to try and benefit the state, to strengthen it, to win concessions from foreign powers, but it wasn't the desire to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It was arguable as to whether or not they were to best practices to look after the affairs of the citizen. Rather, there was a large desire to conform to external pressure, and for some people it's even like keeping up with the Joneses, where you one infatuated with Western culture and want to do things that way. Some of these matters actually were brought to a head and caused not just a change in ideas and thinking, they actually caused quite serious political consequences. This is Sultan AbdulAziz, who died in 1876. By all accounts, a very sincere man. He'd traveled a lot. He'd actually traveled before he became Sultan and the Khalifa. He'd visited Europe. He had a fundamental disagreement with constitutional reforms with one of his chief ministers, Midhat Pasha. Midhat Pasha was part of an opposition group known as the Young Ottomans, not the Young Turks, the Young Ottomans, but they were more influenced by the external Western powers. They were more influenced by secular thinking, and he had a fundamental disagreement with Midhat Pasha, and things came to a head in 1876, where he opposed some changes that Midhat Pasha was proposing, and within 1 week of those changes being opposed, the Sultan was found dead with both his wrists cut in an apparent suicide. Now, nobody really believes this was a suicide, actually. When you look, this was in 1876, look at this communique again in historical documents from the United States, some of their diplomats communicating to each other, talking about Midhat Pasha. I'm going to read this for those who can't read the small print. Midhat Pasha was the ideal of Turkish statesmanship, they said, a reformer and a true patriot. He has been a prime favorite with the British Embassy and was relied upon to circumvent and bring to naught the machinations imputed to Russia. It was he who had compassed the fall of the late Sultan AbdulAziz and the deposition of Murad V, who had escaped the assassin when his associates, Hussein Avni Pasha and Rashid Pasha, were slain, who had marshalled Young Turkey and the Sofias alike under the attractive banner of reform, who had supplanted the moderate and prudent Mehmet Rushdie Pasha, and, constitution in hand, had assumed for the second time the high office of Grand Vizier, and who had spurned the conditions offered by the conference, bidding defiance to the great powers of Europe and asserting the lofty independence of Turkey. Well, that's all very confused. It's talking about a particular context of negotiation. But what you can see described by these American diplomats who were writing to each other at the time is a guy who's favored by the British, a reformer, a patriot, somebody who has had a hand in the fall of Sultan AbdulAziz. And really what this is a lesson to us of is beware the potential for foreign agents in the administration. When I say foreign agents, I don't mean that every agent by this is somebody who's a paid servant of another power, but somebody who's influenced by them, whether intellectually or whether in other ways, is falling into the agenda of foreign powers. AbdulAziz was replaced by Sultan Murad V, who had mental illness, so he was only in office for a very short period of time. And then these figures around Murad, like Medet Pasha and others, they appointed as the successor a very young Sultan Abdul Hamid, who they thought would be a guy who would be easy to manipulate, and they did not know the half of this man who was in office in the Khilafah for decades. And really, having been dealt a very difficult hand to play with, did extremely well in trying to harness the Khilafah in its dying days. Otto von Bismarck, the great German statesman of the era, said if wisdom was 100 grams, Abdul Hamid had 90 grams of it. He himself, Bismarck, had 5 grams, and the rest of the leaders and politicians had the remaining 5 grams. I mean, that's one man's testimony on his political acumen and wisdom. Abdul Hamid, Allah give him rahmah, was deposed in 1909 by the Young Turks. Now, they were a group of nationalists, very affected by secular ideas, but it wasn't that they wanted to destroy the Khilafah, abolish it, and to establish a secular state, but they wanted a rebalancing of power in the constitution, and they had been affected by the secular ideas, particularly what we talked about in the last episode, where we talked about the influence of ideas. So Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, Ahmed Pasha were the 3 rulers of the Young Turks. There was a Khalifa there, but he was just nominal by this stage. And they tried to oppose more Western encroachment, for example, into Libya and elsewhere. And they were actually quite impressed by some of the Islamic zeal with which the people of places like Libya repelled the Western colonial agenda there. And they built upon the Ottoman relationship with Europe. With Germany, sorry. That Ottoman relationship with Germany was brought in to a more solid relationship by World War I. Abdul Hamid had spent years trying to play the balance of power and trying not to get embroiled in conflicts between different European powers, because he was aware that if the Ottoman Khilafah had got sucked into those, it would actually weaken it further. The Young Turks were less cautious on this. At the outset of World War I, initially the Khilafah was neutral, but the British put an ultimatum to them that either you're with us or against us. And they had a contract with the Khilafah where the Khilafah had paid for these dreadnought ships. and the British had not delivered them after making them, so after building them. So this effectively was seen as an act of war, and the Khilafah immediately allied with Germany. By this stage, even then, even in that very declined state, the war was declared as a jihad by the Sheikh al-Islam, and in an attempt to try and unite or bring on board the Muslims around the world, some of whom, for example, in India, were fighting in the British Army. Again, an indication Islam was still the basis. And a lesson there really is that the pan-Islamic bonds, which had become weaker and weaker over the previous century, i.e. the unity of the Ummah, that is actually really a source of strength, but it must be sincerely for the sake of Islam and not pragmatic or opportunistic as it was seen to be in this dying era. The nationalistic bonds would never deliver. So I hope that explains some of the factors, and we'll be back for our next session, which is really going to be talking about some of the external factors. The two things I really want to talk about more is, one, the relationship with Western powers, particularly Britain, and following that, the effect of the aftermath of World War I, which led to the abolition of the Khilafah and laying the seeds for the tragedy of the Muslim world and the Middle East that we have today. I hope that was helpful. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.